Rome didn't fall in a single night. It withdrew, quietly. And when it left Britain, it didn't just take soldiers. It took order, it took protection, it took civilization itself. What remained was something far darker than history usually admits. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman Britain was part of something bigger. Roads stretched across the land. Cities stood with stone walls, bathhouses, markets, law. There was structure, there was control. But around the early 5th century, Rome stopped answering. No reinforcements, no money, no protection. And Britain was left alone. Around 410 AD, a message arrived that would change everything. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a plan. It was an instruction. Defend yourselves. 4 centuries of reliance ended in a single sentence. The Roman legions, once stationed across Britain, were gone. Not defeated, not destroyed. Recalled. Pulled back to defend an empire already collapsing under its own weight. And Britain was no longer part of that empire. It was something else now. Something exposed. At first, nothing seemed to change. The cities still stood. The roads still cut across the land with precision. Walls still cast long shadows over organized streets. But systems like this don't collapse instantly. They decay. Without Roman administration, something subtle began to happen. Taxes were no longer collected. Soldiers no longer paid. Officials disappeared from their posts. Orders stopped coming. And without orders, structure began to dissolve. What once felt permanent started to feel uncertain. Power doesn't vanish, it shifts. Local leaders stepped forward, trying to fill the void Rome had left behind. But they weren't Rome. They didn't have the network, the discipline, the reach. Authority became fragmented, regional, unstable. Small territories began to form, each with its own ruler, each with its own rules. And without a central force holding everything together, conflict became inevitable. Britain wasn't united anymore. It was breaking apart. Slowly, but completely. Then came the silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of abandonment. Roman cities that once thrived began to empty. Not because they were destroyed, but because they were no longer sustainable. Trade had slowed, protection had weakened, and people left. Londinium, once alive with movement, became something else entirely. Stone buildings stood untouched. Streets remained intact, but life was gone. Entire cities left behind like shells of a forgotten world. And as structure weakened, others began to notice. From the north came the Picts. From the west, raiders moved along the coast. And from across the sea, the Saxons arrived. At first, they weren't conquerors. They were invited, hired as mercenaries. A desperate attempt to replace the protection Rome once provided. But inviting force comes with a cost, because once power enters, it rarely leaves willingly. The Saxons didn't just defend Britain, they began to reshape it. Land was taken, territories expanded, and slowly, the balance shifted. What started as assistance became occupation. Cultural lines blurred, then disappeared. Roman traditions faded, new languages emerged, new identities formed, and the Britain Rome once controlled was no longer recognizable. But one of the most profound losses wasn't physical, it was intellectual. Literacy declined, records stopped being kept. Knowledge that once moved freely began to disappear. Skills were forgotten, systems were lost, and history itself became harder to trace. This is why this period is often called the Dark Age, not just because it was violent, but because it became harder to see. By the time stability began to return, Britain had changed completely. The Roman world was gone, not destroyed in a single moment, but erased over time, replaced by something new, something unfamiliar, and something far less connected to what came before. Rome didn't just leave Britain, it revealed something deeper. How fragile order really is, how quickly systems collapse when the structure holding them disappears. Because civilization isn't permanent, it's maintained. And when maintenance stops, darkness doesn't wait. Ledger never forgets, and neither should you. Stay in the shadows. The darkness is just beginning. Subscribe now if you dare follow the truth.